appeal to the other, believe the best, believe the truth. Here's another one. Communicate your affection. And we talked about this a few weeks ago as well, that in love we are continually reaffirming our love for one another. And we see that as well. Paul does it again. He did it in the very beginning of the book. He did it at the end. He continues throughout. Look at how he speaks about Onesimus. He says this, I'm sending him back to you, sending my very heart. Man, Paul is bridging this divide with Philemon and Onesimus. He's going, man, Onesimus is coming back to you, and I know, like for you, your heart is wrenched over him. You probably hate him a little bit. You're probably angry at him. You're definitely frustrated and hurt. You feel violated by him, but you got to know, man, my heart breaks for this guy. I love this guy, and my heart is for him. And when I send him, I'm sending my very heart. And Paul's speaking about a deep, intimate connection and bonding that he's had with Onesimus through his salvation, through the short time that they've been together, and as Onesimus has served Paul and cared for Paul while he has been in prison. And Paul's like, man, I'm sending him back. He's grown very dear to my heart, and yet he's sending him back. And friends, he is reaffirming love and reestablishing love, and he's building a bridge again between them and building that affection and restoring it. Because isn't it, I don't know if it's like this in your relationships, but when there's a conflict, all of a sudden, the amount of affection, the amount of relationship, the amount of equity seems very small, right? And you almost forget how much you love that person, or how much you really like that person, or how much investment you have in that person. And in that moment, like that seems small, but everything else seems just grandiose, does it not? It's like the giant Grand Canyon of hurt or emotions or divide or conflict or anger. And that's everything. And friends, in the midst of it, to appeal to one another, to believe the best and believe the truth, but then also, friends, also to affirm your love and to reaffirm that and to communicate that affection before the conflict, during the conflict, and even after the conflict is so vital. Man, to start your conflicts, when you've got to go have a hard conversation. How many love having hard conversations? Anybody here love those? You're like, I live for those. I live for those. I was born for that. In fact, Jesus wrote it on the back of my skull, on the inside, not the outside. You can't see it, but he wrote, good at conflict. Loves a hard conversation, right? Most of us were like, no, thank you, I'd rather not, right? And most of us, I don't want to say most of us sane people. Let me just say that. I feel like it's most of us sane people. We're just like, we don't like that, right? We recognize it's difficult. We recognize it's hard. We recognize the risks that are involved. But friends, to even start and just go, can I just tell you first how much I really appreciate you? What if we began our conversations, what if we began our conflict resolutions with that? What if we even just practice for ourselves, maybe 3 to 5 different things? Can we just reaffirm each other right now because I want to kill you? Right? Can I just tell you, I love you. You're the apple of my eye. You do it for me like no one else does. Now, can we get to the difficult thing here? Man, doesn't it just start on a good place? Doesn't it just begin to build a bridge between each other? To reaffirm that. And then in the midst of it, right, as you're talking through it, as you're working through it, I love you. Thank you for doing this. I know this isn't easy. I know I'm not easy sometimes. I know you're not easy sometimes. But thank you for doing this, right? Communicate that affection and definitely restore that affection afterwards. Recommunicate it over and over. You can't say I love you enough. Friends, you just can't. Right? Don't wait for the skies to part and the glory to shine down from heaven, because more often than not, it won't, and you will have missed 1,000 opportunities to tell someone they mean the world to you. Communicate your affection. Lastly here, we see it in verse 18 and 19. Look what he says. Paul says this, if he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it, to say nothing of you owing me, even your own self. Paul's like, man, I'll pay it, whatever it is. I want to see the two of you restored. And Paul's coming in, and he's building a bridge between them, because so many times the chasm that is formed is not just the words that were said or the thing that was done, but it was really what was taken and what was lost and what was broken. And now we're like, man, there is a wound here that needs to be healed. There is a loss that needs to be restored and needs to be found. And there's a place that needs to be fixed and repaired. And for those who care about relationships, for those who are the followers of Jesus Christ, for those of us who want to bridge that divide, want to see relationships restored, it has to be repaid and restored what was lost. Paul sees that, and Paul does something amazingly. I mean, he is willing to cover the cost. Paul's not exactly wealthy, friends. In fact, Paul's living on the support of other people, and yet Paul's going like, I'm going to go hungry for a few days so that you guys can be restored here. I'm going to work some extra nights making some tents after preaching my heart out, after evangelizing, and after planting a church. I'm going to work extra hours just so I can pay off the debts so that the two of you can come back together. He's like, Philemon, I'm willing to do that because you're worth it. He's worth it. And Christ is worth it. And Father, for the followers of Jesus Christ, friends, this is the call of God on our lives. There was an IRS agent, not a very honest IRS agent. In fact, he would audit people, and he would take advantage of them amidst the audits. Nobody seemed to know, and nobody seemed to care enough to follow up and to hold this guy accountable. But he would go in and he would audit people, find out every little last cent that they owed, and then he would exact amazing amounts of interest on them over and over and over. And when they would give him the payments for that, he would cut it into multiple different ways, and he would put some to go to the IRS and some to put in his own pocket. Now, how this ever happened, how this ever went on is beyond me. But it went on for a long time, long enough that this man's conscience began to be pricked, began to be worked on. And this man was convicted about sin, righteousness, and judgment, and he realized, man, I need a Savior, and he gave his life to Jesus. He was transformed, and he actually went back and remade and repaid everything that he had taken. In fact, he paid it back with interest. Friends, that's not a new story and a current story. That's a story from 2,000 years ago. That's the story of Zacchaeus, a little tax collector, and I do mean little. He was short size, you know. But that guy, man, he carried a big stick. And he carried such a big stick that he took advantage of people. But when Jesus came into his life, when Jesus was in his life, and all of a sudden he saw the beauty and the righteousness and the purity of Jesus and the holiness of his character, and yet the compassion that he would come into a life and come into the home of one such as him, man, he gave his life over to Jesus, and he knew enough about the law because he had extorted people according to it. He knew enough about the law that the law said, for those that you defraud, for those that you take advantage of, from those that you steal, and you do it intentionally, you pay back not just what you owe, not just what you owe with interest, but 4 times. That's why Zacchaeus, when he comes to Jesus, he doesn't just sit there and go, Jesus, I'm sorry for what I did. Thank you for being here. And goes about his life and kind of goes to church every once in a while, throws some pennies. No. He restores. He makes it right because he's repentant. And that is a heart that is transformed. That is the heart of those who really want conflict to be eradicated from not only their lives, their relationships, but even this world, if they can be part of that and be an influencer for that. And because of that, he was willing to say 4 times. Up to 4 times I will pay them back because that's what the law required. And not only that, he's like, I've made so much money taking advantage of people, I need to give back to people. And he said up to half of my wealth to the poor. And he brought those bank accounts, he brought those estates back into right balance. Why? Because his life was changed. And friends, that's the reality for those who are in Christ. That's the reality for those. Man, if you want to build a bridge with somebody, if you want to see a relationship restored, now, there may be forgiveness in a unilateral sense. We may be able to forgive and release. We talked about that. To be able to release them from that debt. And that is what forgiveness is in its first step. It is releasing them from that debt. The next step, though, is when they come and they apologize and they ask forgiveness, to reconcile with them. To become at peace again. It is the forgiveness that you have given prior to give them in that moment and to release them from that debt. But that person who has put themselves in debt is now putting themselves to the work for those who are truly repentant of redoing, remaking, restoring, and repairing what was lost and what was taken. And friends, that's so vitally important when it comes to conflict. Some of us are so much like, whoops, sorry. Hey, why don't you forgive me? Why don't you forgive me? Why don't you forgive me? And part of it's like, well, because you've done this 12 times, and I continue to forgive you, yeah, but there's a problem. We're not going to be restored fully in relationship until you recognize that you got to do something differently here. We are at peace. You're forgiven. We are at peace together, but we're not restored fully in relationship because you're not willing to repay. You're not willing to restore. The principles apply when bridging a divide: appeal, believe, communicate that affection, and repay and restore. Here's our last point this morning. When the divide is too critical or complex, a good mediator is a must. When the divide is too critical or complex, a good mediator is a must. And Paul was that mediator. Paul was that one who would bridge the divide. Paul was the one who would step in the gap between Philemon and Onesimus. Could you imagine what would have happened if Onesimus showed back up in Philemon's life? Do you think he would have opened his door to him? Anybody think so? No. Do you think he would have been willing to, kind of hear out Onesimus? He's probably like, no. If anything, he's going to see him coming a mile off, and he's going to be calling the authorities and throwing that guy into jail. And Paul's like, man, I need to appeal here. And Paul's like, I'm going to bridge the divide. And Paul is a mediator, bringing the two broken parties back together. And friends, when conflict gets too complex, right? When it is too difficult for your understanding. And sometimes I've told couples, like when we're in counseling together, I'm like, hey, 3 times is a pattern, right? 3 times is a pattern. If you guys have come at it once and it's not working, come at it again and try it again. And if you still can't do it, come at it from another angle a 3rd time. And if that happens and you still can't do it, 3 times is a pattern, you need help. You need somebody outside of yourself, because that situation, either you don't understand and know how to bridge the divide, how to get back from that thing, or it's too difficult and it requires someone with specialized training for that. When the divide is too complex, or sometimes it's too critical, right? Sometimes the injury is so deep. Sometimes the wound is so bloody. Emotionally speaking, sometimes even physically speaking. Sometimes it is too critical that you need someone else in the midst. Maybe for protection, maybe for advice, maybe for counsel. You need a mediator. Not just any mediator, though, because there's a lot of bad mediators out there, right? Some of you have gone to them, right? You've tried to get counsel. Maybe you talk to the guys around the water cooler, or you're talking to a friend, and they just they mean well, right? They mean well, and yet they've got horrible counsel, right? Anybody ever gone to a bad mediator and they're like trying to give you counsel, and you're like listening to it, and even as you're listening to it, you're like, I know I'm messed up, but at the same time, this sounds so weird and so off. But okay, let's try it, and now it's like World War III, and it was only like a small skirmish, right? Bad mediators, poor counsel, they usually end up bringing more conflict with them. Sometimes they're the source of more conflict, not in the conflict of trying to help bring out the real root issues and help bringing resolution, but there's more conflict that arises. Sometimes they're a bad mediator because of triangulation. Anybody heard of triangulation? Counselors use this word. It's the idea of a third party getting involved in a situation that needs to be resolved by two specific people or two specific parties, right? And sometimes that bad mediator is now a sounding board, and not just a sounding board, because we all need a good sounding board, don't we? When you're in the midst of it, you need somebody just to hear, somebody to help process, somebody to work through those issues and to help get the bad out so you can open up for the good again. And yet in the midst of it, sometimes in our insecurities, we use those people to talk to. And we use those people to talk to, and we talk to them so that they can talk to the other person. And rather than talking to the other person, I'm like, I'll tell you and you tell them. Or I'll work with you and you work with them, maybe. Or I'll tell you what, you work with me and I'll work with you. And we'll just get them out, and then triangulation becomes a very manipulative situation and a very insecurity-inducing situation, very unhealthy and dysfunctional. That's a bad mediator. And sometimes you turn to a friend as that. Sometimes it's a family member. Some of you grew up in a household that was like that. Nobody would ever deal with something to their face. There's a point at which, we talk about this, but at some point, you have to actually have the conversation with the person you're having the conflict with. At some point, you actually need to work through this issue and talk through it. Or maybe you need to stop being friends with me for a while so you can go and try and be friends again with them, right? Bad mediators. That's not the ones we need. We need good mediators, wise counsel. And a good mediator is a must when the divide is too critical or complex. What does a good mediator look like? A good mediator helps people to communicate, helps people to understand, helps people to reconcile once again. A good mediator is somebody who engages the two who are at odds against each other, not for personal gain, but rather to serve the two that are broken and the relationship that is broken. A good mediator uses their influence to encourage and persuade the parties, not to manipulate and control, right? Respects boundaries, respects freedom. A good mediator is one who then also gets out of the way when the two people begin to reconnect, when they begin to reconcile, right? Sometimes that bad mediator, they get involved because, man, they have a need within themselves just to be part of everything, right? Maybe they're a busybody and they're like, I got to know everybody's business because I just love everybody's business. It's juicy morsels and I feel so needed and I feel so important when I'm at the center of everyone's problems, right? That's scary. It is. But truthfully, can I just lovingly speak to you? Some of you have that in your hearts. Some of you, that's at work in your heart. You don't feel special until people need you. And friends, that's something that you need to work through with Jesus. Because there's a deep need that you have, a deep need for significance that you got to find in healthy ways, rather in ways that end up attaching people to you in unhealthy attachments, rather than helping foster the healing relationships that they need. A good mediator is even willing sometimes to cover the costs when necessary. Sometimes people just don't have it. Sometimes they've devastated themselves like the prodigal son, and they've got nothing more, and they need a prodigal father, a lavish spending father who's like, man, I forgive you and I release you. Come on back. I'll pay it, and welcome back. Sometimes they need someone else to cover the costs when necessary until they can. Now, don't get me wrong, friends. The Apostle Paul is paying these costs, but guess what? He's paying them because he knows there's no way Onesimus is going to be able to bridge the divide on his own. There's no way Onesimus can also pay for these things back. Like, he's not going to be able to work enough. He doesn't have the ability to work right now, and so the only way he can pay back and make something in return for Philemon is to actually go and work and begin to work extra and repay it over time. And Paul's like, man, I'll pay that bill. I'll cover the cost. I will be the benefactor for the moment. When the divide is too critical or complex, a good mediator is a must. Anybody need a mediator in their relationships right now? Have you ever needed one? Maybe a good friend? Maybe a Christian brother or sister that you can come alongside, one that is wise, one that's mature, one that you've seen work through conflict before. Or maybe you need a good mediator, like a small group leader that's in your life. Somebody working through those issues and doing the best they can. Or maybe you need a trained counselor or a pastor to even come alongside and to speak truth and to bring their expertise to bear in those moments. Friends, don't be too self-reliant. Don't be too self-confident to not embrace the help that is there. We're about to close, so I'm gonna call the worship team up now. As they're coming, how many remember the nursery rhyme, London Bridges? Anyone remember that? London Bridge is falling down, right? Okay, you got it, right? Some of you do. Some of you need to go to nursery school again. I always wonder, where do these nursery rhymes come from? Who writes them? Do they have a story? They seem to have a story. I mean, they're talking about London, right? Well, it's interesting. I was reading a couple articles that said the meaning of London Bridge is falling down has long been debated by historians and other experts. I wasn't alone. Like many popular children's stories, there are some darker meanings that may lurk underneath the song's surface. However, the most commonly accepted origin story for the rhyme is that of the bridge actually falling down in 1014 AD because Viking leader Olaf Haraldsson allegedly pulled it down during an invasion of the British Isles. The tale of the attack inspired a collection of Old Norse poems written in 1230. But then again, a London Bridge has fallen down loads of times. Loads of times after the Romans left Britain in the 5th century. Ice damage was a cause as it crumbled in 1281, then in 1309, then in 1425, and again in 1437. It was also weakened by multiple fires in the 1600s, including the devastating Great Fire of London in 1666. One dark theory behind the bridge's Jenga-like tendencies maintains that there were bodies encased in its moorings. Author Alice Bertha Gomez suggests that the nursery rhyme refers to the medieval practice known as immurement. Immurement is when a person is encased into a room with no openings or exits and left there to die, sometimes for punishment, sometimes for sacrifice. According to Gomez, the lyric, "Take the key and lock her up," was a nod to the legendary belief that the bridge would collapse if there wasn't a body buried inside. Eee, it's creepy, right? What are our kids singing? Through all of its feeble fables and structural failures, the London Bridge teetered and tottered for about 600 years. When it was finally demolished in 1831, it was more cost-effective to replace it rather than to repair it. That's crazy. Now, why did London bridges keep falling down, right? Why did they keep falling down? Not because nursery rhymes kept singing it and kids started singing it. It kept falling down because of the conflicts that surrounded it, because of the harsh treatment it took, and because of the poor patchwork repairs. Does that kind of sound familiar at all? Maybe to some of the conflicts that we've endured and gone through. Maybe some of the relationships that we have, and we've man, this is not getting better. And we're why can't we get past these things? Friends, because you need something stronger. You need someone stronger. You need someone who is a better bridge. You need Jesus, who is a better mediator as well. In fact, as 1 Timothy 2:5 says, "For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for us all."